Should have known about using chalk when you have black pants on, but you know, that's the way it goes. All right. Band pick of the week this week is Simon and Garfunkel, Sounds of Silence. Not band pick of the week, classic album of the week, classic album of the week. This one was from 1965. Sounds of Silence was one of their first big hits. Obviously Paul Simon sort of kept around longer than Art Garfunkel did in terms of after they split up. But I Am a Rock is on here. The Sounds of Silence, A Most Peculiar Man, all sorts of good tunes on this. 1965. So you might want to take a look at this. In addition, when I was going through my albums for this, I came across, we had Van Morrison at the beginning of the week as last week's classic album. If we recall, Van Morrison also did a song called Gloria. How many have ever heard the song Gloria? Okay, most of you should have heard the song Gloria. Anyway, he was with a band called Them before he became Van Morrison. And I came across, I have a bonus pack 2-record set, Them, with their the two albums. This is featuring Van Morrison as the lead singer. So this came out after Van Morrison obviously had made it, it is, and this one actually is in stereo. In those days you had monaural as well as stereo. I noticed that I paid $3.60 for this double album, so it must have been a good buy. So, all right. Last time we were talking about also, just as a reminder, the 11 o'clock section here is I zoom it as well. I mainly do that in case something happens to, somebody was here earlier, something happened to Dr. Butters and the world came to an end, so that the only way that we had a recording of this would be the Zoom recording, which is not nearly as good a quality. But anyway, the point is that if you're for some reason you're quarantined or something happens and you can't make it to class, you can get in, and I mentioned this earlier on, onto the Zoom by just going to the personal meeting ID, which is also listed in your folder, which is, as I mentioned earlier, just my phone number, 517-607-2376, and Wolfram is the password with just WOLFRAM with the little w. So you can just click in. You don't have to get invited to watch that. All right. We were talking last time about responsibility, and that why do we want people responsible for their actions? We want them to be responsible because they'll behave differently, right? And they'll behave in a more efficient fashion. And they'll make better use of the fact that they're knowledgeable beings. And we talked about, Hayek focuses on the fact that information is decentralized, and you're the best person to know how to make the best use of resources, of your personal resources, and you're the best person to know what you value things at. The other thing was that if you're not responsible, those who are will coerce you, right? We talked about driving and your parents, putting limitations on your ability to drive where you want to, or listen to the radio or whatever. But if the government becomes responsible, then the government's going to coerce you. If the government's responsible for health care, right, the government's going to say, okay, this is the kind of health care that you have to have. And this is the kind of health care that your employers have to provide in terms of your insurance or whatever. So the more that you rely on the government to do something, or anyone else, and if you allow them to take on your responsibilities, then they're going to be coerced. So those are the two main things that he was talking about, why we want to have people be responsible for their actions. And then at the end, we noted that you can't be responsible for something outside of your foresight, right? That is, And because why? Because what's the idea of responsibility? We want you to behave in an efficient fashion. But if it's something that you couldn't have thought about, then it doesn't make sense to have you be responsible for it. Now, again, in my law and economics class, we talk about we want you to take proper precaution in terms of accidents. Maybe you didn't know that accident was going to happen, but you could reduce the probability of the accident happening if you were to drive the speed limit or whatever. So we would like you to do that. So you could be held responsible for something. It was still within your foresight in the sense that had you driven the speed limit, you could have reduced the chance of that accident happening, right? So that we just want you to we want you to behave in the most efficient fashion is why we want you to be responsible. And then we noted that it doesn't make sense to have you be responsible for the actions of others unless we're talking about children or something like that where they can't be responsible for their own selves. But for in general, it doesn't make sense for you to be responsible for the actions of others because you want them to behave in the most efficient fashion. But that means that you can't be blamed for the actions of people who are of the same party that you are, or for people who are of the same tribe that you are, or of the same nationality that you are. So you can't say, oh yeah, the Germans did this, you're German, so I can do that to you, right? So you would have much less conflict if people just viewed it as that way. That is, conflicts would only happen when you are, how many of you have ever heard of the Hatfields and McCoys? Okay, good, right? So why does this conflict between the Hatfields and McCoys going on? Because if the Hatfields do something, then the McCoys can, do something to any of the Hatfields, and vice versa. So if they had all read Hayek's Constitution of Liberty and read through the chapter on responsibility, then you wouldn't have the story of the Hatfields and McCoys. All right, so what is chapter 6 about? Chapter 6 is really a focus on equality under the law, right? So if we're looking at chapter 6, what is the main focus of this chapter? It's about explaining why equality under the law is important. And you'll recall that he's making the point that liberty requires this. Freedom requires equality under the law. But he says that's the only equality that's consistent with individual liberty. Right? This is the only equality that's consistent with individual liberty. Right? And notice how much this sounds like Mises. Right? What was one of the foundations of liberalism? Was equality under the law, right? If you go back and look at the first midterm, what was one of the things I asked you about is what are the foundations of liberalism and why are they in there, right? Equality under the law is important, and because why? That makes it so that there's social cooperation, right? You guys don't believe that. That you're not going to, the government's not going to do something just bad just to you, okay? And so we'll have more social cooperation if we have equality in the law. But then he says that, what does Mises say? You got to have inequality of income, right? So one of the foundations of liberalism is equality under the law. One of the other foundations is inequality of income. And what is Hayek saying here? He says that the only equality that is consistent with individual liberty is equality under the law. And then what does he say? He says liberty produces inequality, right? Just like Mises was saying that market capitalism results in inequality of income. Hayek says here that that liberty produces inequality of income. And again, if we sort of think through why that happens, is because what does liberty require? We just talked in chapter 5 that you're responsible for your actions, right? Which means you get rewarded if you do something that pleases other people, and you suffer losses if you make use of resources where the people don't value the resources you used up as much as the opportunity cost of those resources. Okay? So what Hayek is talking about here is very consistent with what Mises was talking about in terms of how markets work, right? Mises going, the only way to produce wealth for the masses is market capitalism, and it requires, one of the things it requires is equality under the law, and one of the things it requires is inequality of income. Hayek's talking about freedom, he's talking about liberty, and he says, what does liberty need? The only way you can have liberty is equality under the law, but liberty produces inequality of income. So again, very consistent with what Mises was saying, because people have different talents, right? Talents and abilities, and they work harder or less. Just all the things we can think about that results in how much income they got, right? These results in how much income they receive, they earn. And again, if we could go back to what we've been talking about from the very beginning, how do you earn economic profit, or that people get paid the value of their marginal product, and what Mises was saying is the only way to make the poor wealthier is to increase their marginal product by education or giving them more tools to work with, etc. There's going to be an inequality of income is going to be a result of liberty, because liberty requires that you be held responsible for your actions, which requires that people get rewarded based on how much they please other people, and so you're going to have a difference in their ability to do that, and so you'll end up with a difference in equality of income. All right, so that leads us to chapter 7. As I said before, chapter 6 is a chapter that we'll just summarize here like we did, but chapter 7 we'll look at in a little more detail. Because chapter 7 is talking about one of the other fundamental principles, and that is one of the other fundamental principles of liberalism that you, again, talked about on the exam, is what? It's democracy, right? How do we make choices when we have a collective group? Well, if we have to make a choice for all of us, right? Then how do we make that choice? So again, if we had to have a uniform, right? If everybody has to wear the same thing, we got to have some mechanism for making that determination. Again, the democracy, he says, is a means to an end, right? He says it's a means to an end. It's not an end in itself. Right? Not an end in itself. And what does he mean by that? He says, okay, what are we trying to do with democracy? It's a method of determining what the law is going to be, right? It's a method of determining it's a means to get to this end. We want to have the law be such that what? That it maximizes the total amount of freedom, right? That minimizes the total amount of coercion. So what's the how do we make decisions when your what you want to do conflicts with what I want to do, right? So we got to have something that establishes where that boundary is. And how do we make that law? How do we make those boundaries? We have a mechanism to do that, and democracy is the way that we do that. And it is not an end in itself, right? It doesn't say just because the majority agreed that it makes it good law, right? We don't say, oh yeah, this law is a good law. It's not that the law is good because the majority agreed. Right? It's not an end in itself, right? You don't say, oh yeah, well, this law must have been fine because we agreed with it, right? The majority, we had majority rule, that's fine, okay? That's not what you're looking at when you're looking at democracy. You're saying, okay, it's going to be flawed. If you take my public choice class, we talk a lot about different ways of voting, for example, even. Whether you have what's called first past the post or whatever, or winner take all. One of the things that, if you look at the 2016 election, what did you have? You had a candidate that won the Republican nomination when that candidate had a lot of people that he was their least favorite choice. Don't remember the 2016 election, but what happened was there was lots of Republicans that were running in the primary, okay? And there was a lot of them that had a sort of a market-oriented view of how we ought to allocate resources, right? Sort of a limited government type of idea. But what was happening? They were dividing up the vote, right? So let's, just to give you a quick example, suppose that you have 3 candidates that are running, and there's one candidate gets 34%, the other 2 candidates get 33%. But the 33% that voted for the other 2 candidates, the first candidate was their least preferred. So what happens? The candidate that won, 2/3 of the voters thought that was the worst candidate, right? Then I don't know if you remember in 2016, Trump said I could stand in the middle of the street in New York and shoot somebody and I'd still get 34% of the vote. Okay, well, that's my example. Okay, so what happens is now if you look at, there are people who think that as that candidate, this is in 2016. Now he's had 4 years to, implement policy, et cetera, right? And that may change how people's views are. But if you look back to the 2016 election, you ended up with a situation where you had a candidate that ended up winning the primary that a lot of people thought was worse than the other candidates. Now, that didn't mean they didn't vote for him in the general election, but the point was in Econ 415 and public choice, we worked through different mechanisms of voting. You could have what's called alternative vote, or you could have a vote where you rank your candidates and you get 3 points for the candidate that's number 1 and 2 for number 2 and 1 for number 3, and then you add up the total points and whoever has the most total points wins. There's different ways of doing that. The point that I'm trying to make here is that democracy is a mechanism of getting to where only one outcome, right? And it's a mechanism to do that, and that doesn't mean democracy, if just because we did it through majority vote means that law was a good law, right? You can have problems with the law, again, if we talk about Mises, the unintended consequences issue that Mises brought up when we were reading liberalism. He says that, remember that Bastiat talked about whether if the law were limited to a just law, that is, the only thing that did is protect life, liberty, and property. Remember that Bastiat said, if you had a just law, a just government, if you had a just government, then he said it wouldn't matter what the form was, right? And he also talks about we didn't emphasize this, but and he talks about in his book, The Law, he talks about you don't need universal suffrage. Right? You don't need everybody to vote. Right? You could have an authoritarian government as long as if that government were limited the protection of life, liberty, and property, you wouldn't need a situation where people were voting on it. Right? Now, what Hayek says here is he argues that it's not obvious that everybody voting on something is some form of general principle. Right? So what does Hayek say? He says, universal suffrage, that is, everybody votes on every issue, right? Everyone votes on every issue. He says it's not clear that you need this, or that it's the correct thing to do. Just to give you that there's no basic principle about universal suffrage, another way to put it, right? It's not a basic principle. That's how he words it. And if you sort of think through that, what's the relevant voting population, right? How do I know what the relevant voting population might be? What is that relevant voting population? Let me give you an example in a moment here. What is the relevant voting population? In Michigan, you have what's called the Uniform City Income Tax Law. And the way it works is that a city can impose an income tax if it has a 1% there are some exceptions, the city of Detroit being one of them. But in general, the way it works is a city can impose an income tax of 1% on its residents and 0.5% on non-residents. Okay? So, but how does the city determine that? Right? Through an election. But who gets to vote in that election? Under the law, the city residents vote on that election. The non-residents don't vote. Okay? Now, should the non-residents be able to vote on that? Well, you might say, yeah, because they're going to be taxed on this. But you might say that, well, wait a minute, the non-resident, if the alternative, which is the only other alternative in the state of Michigan, is a property tax law, you're going to say, well, wait a minute. Somebody lives in Jonesville and comes in and works in the city of Hillsdale, right? They don't pay any property taxes, so they don't pay to get the roads fixed, right? They don't pay for the police and the fire that they're making use of those services. So if their car catches on fire or something for some reason, or somebody steals their car while they're in Hillsdale, they expect the Hillsdale City Police to deal with it, or the Hillsdale Fire Department to deal with it, right? So you might say, well, wait, this is really about paying for the services, right? It's sort of an indirect way of paying for the services. So the point is that it's not clear whether, which is the way to do it. Should we have everybody vote on it? Should we have only the people that live in the city vote on it? But the fundamental principle is that it may not be obvious who ought to be voting on things. And so Hayek's point here is the idea of universal suffrage. The more you vote, the better. The more people that can vote, the better. There's not a basic principle about that. You need to have to think through and say, gee, what's the optimal way to do that? And again, in my public choice class, that's one of the things that we study is how you determine who should be voting on things. And again, consistent with Bastiat in the sense that if you had a government that was limited the protection of life, liberty, and property, which both Bastiat and Hayek want to do, right? Because Hayek's wanting to maximize the total amount of liberty and minimize the total amount of coercion. They both come up with this sort of general idea that essentially if the form of government were corrected, you didn't have to worry about that. Then he makes an important point. He says, the power of the temporary majority has to be limited by some general principle. The power of the temporary majority must be limited by some long-term general principle. And what does he mean by that? Okay. Well, what does he mean by the power of the temporary majority? Well, if you're going to have democracy, because that's what he's discussing here, and again, he's going to say democracy, just like liberalism said, democracy is not the perfect way of doing it, but it's one of the foundations of liberalism. Why is it one of the foundations of liberalism? Because it's the most likely to lead to social cooperation, right? You don't. I mean, if this were Libya, you might think, well, the only way that I can change governments is to have a revolution. Well, Libya's been going on with civil war for years. Okay, you don't have civil war in the United States very often, because I know that if I, if I lose, then I have a mechanism to change the government, right? If we lose this time, we can have another election in 2 years if it's a congressional race, or it's a presidential race, and 4 years from now we can try it again, right? So you don't have to have a violent revolution. So the temporary majority, though, has got to be limited in what it can do, right? That's what he's saying. And how are we going to limit it? There's going to be some long-term general principle that limits what that temporary majority do. It's a temporary majority, right? If this were in 2016, right, you had the Republicans controlled the House of Representatives, okay? But in 2018, they lost control of the House, okay? But they maintained control of the Senate, okay? But now a question that's coming up in this 2020 election is whether it's pretty clear that the Republicans are not going to win back control of the House. Will they maintain control of the Senate? Okay, we don't know. That's one of the things that's going to happen. So there's a temporary majority, but can they do anything they want when they're in the majority? And that's Hayek's point here, is that the temporary majority has got to be limited by some general principle that we're going to set out. You can't do any old darn thing you want. Right? The temporary majority, if I get control of the House and the Senate and I get control of the presidency, we can't do just anything that we want, right? And so what we want to do is we want to sort of think through what is this general principle by which we're going to govern ourselves, okay? And of course, if looking forward, that's going to be set out in the Constitution. One of the things that the Constitution does is to set out that general principle that we're putting, here's how we're going to govern ourselves. And he says that a group becomes society not by giving themselves laws, but by obeying some common rules of conduct, right? That you become a society How do you become a society? You don't become a society by giving yourself a law, but rather agreeing to some common rules of conduct, right? So, in fact, it was interesting. Ancient Ireland, they actually governed themselves not through laws, but basically agreeing to a common code of conduct. And one time I was talking to a scholar that was in Ireland, and we were discussing that fact. If you read Murray Rothbard's For New Liberty, he talks about ancient Ireland, etc. But the bottom line here is that we don't become a society because we sat down and made up a bunch of laws about ourselves. Okay, you become a society by you agreeing to this kind of thing. We agree on some common code of conduct, how we're going to govern ourselves, how are we going to do that. And notice that we didn't emphasize this, but if you go back and reread the law, Bastiat talks about, he says, if you want people to respect the law, then the law has to be respectable. Right? So again, this is sort of like Bastiat, okay? For people to respect the law, the law has to be respectable. And what he really is meaning here is that, you know what, if the law is inconsistent with how we're going to behave, how we naturally, our sort of general principle, if the law is not consistent by sort of our common belief, and again, in law and economics, we talk about common law in law and economics. If it's inconsistent with that, what's going to happen? People aren't going to behave, right? People are going to violate the law. If it's, if you have a law that, generally we just think this is nonsense, what's going to happen? You're going to have lots of people violating it, right? So that's what Bastiat was talking about. If you wanted people to respect the law, it's got to be respectable, okay? And Hayek's saying here that people become a society by agreeing to this common code of conduct. How are we going to behave? And if you don't agree on that, or if you try to have a law that is inconsistent with that, what's going to happen? People aren't going to obey it. So, when is democracy justified? Okay? When should we vote? He says that democracy is justified, okay, and this is important, when only one outcome can prevail. And he adds the outcome would otherwise prevail by force. Right? So he says, when are we going to vote on something? We're going to vote on it when only one outcome can prevail. Now, what is that really talking about in how markets work, right? How markets work is there's lots of outcomes that can prevail. If you guys change your demand for vinyl records, okay, when you talked about it in the midterm, okay, what happens when the demand for something changes? Right? When the demand for something changes, what will happen? The demand curve shifts to the right. People like vinyl records again. What's going to happen? Price will rise, profits will rise, firms will enter the industry, supply curve shifts to the right, more resources go into it, right? So it's not just one outcome has to happen. We have to have 5,000 LPs and that's it, right? So if you guys change your mind, another outcome can prevail. So in a market, we don't have only one outcome can prevail. We can make lots of different. We don't have to say, the only albums that can be produced are by Simon and Garfunkel. Okay, you don't have that. You have lots of different options that can prevail. But if we were a uniform, let's think about, everybody in here is wearing something different. Right? We didn't have to have one outcome could prevail here. But if we were going to Hillsdale Academy, where they have a uniform, then what happens? Everybody's got to wear the same thing. Okay? So because we don't have a uniform, lots of different outcomes can prevail. You could change your shirt and come in different, dress differently on Monday, right? I could learn not to wear black pants when I'm writing with chalk, white chalk, okay? So lots of different outcomes can prevail. But a uniform, only one outcome can prevail. So that means that, okay, how are we going to make that decision? What's the best way of deciding that? And Hayek's point here is democracy is the best way of making that decision. Okay? We don't have to use it very often. In most cases, you don't have to have a democracy, and we don't have to vote on something in most cases. But if it's a case where only one outcome would prevail, then you use democracy. And why? It's less expensive than fighting. Okay? And again, that's pretty much what Mises was saying, right? It's a point here is that it's less expensive than fighting about it, right? So if we're thinking about, okay, how are we going to structure our government, okay? How are we going to structure our government? Then you ought to have democracy rather than some authoritarian way of doing it, right? Or a monarchy or a oligarchy, okay? So his point here is very similar to what Mises is pointing out, is that it's less expensive than fighting among each other. Then he says, democracy is more likely than any other form of government to produce liberty, which is what we're trying to do, right? We're trying to maximize the amount of your ability to act according to your own plan. And he says, democracy is more likely than any other form of government to produce liberty. And what am I trying to do? I'm trying to produce liberty, right? I'm trying to maximize your ability to act according to your own plan. And democracy is more likely to do that. Again, remember that we were talking about, do you need democracy to have market capitalism? And we said, well, no, you don't, right? Hong Kong and Singapore are almost always ranked number 1 and 2 in terms of economic freedom, but they're certainly not economic liberty, okay? But it is consistent, right? We mentioned that if you were to look at the countries that are highest in economic liberty, they're going to tend to be highest in political liberty as well. And so what Hayek is saying is very much the same thing. Mises said that you can't have political liberty without economic liberty, but he didn't say the opposite. Remember that from the multiple choice question, or it was either the multiple choice or true-false question on the midterm. Okay, and so we're saying that Hayek is saying the same thing in this chapter, that democracy is not the same thing as liberty, right? It's not the same thing, but it's more likely than any other, right? It's not. So we don't say, oh, this is a free country because we have democracy, okay? Again, we've mentioned this earlier, your ability to pick your own monarch or your own benevolent dictator, it doesn't mean that you're free, okay? You're free if you can act according to your own plan. So there's a difference between a democratic society and a free society. And if you listen to the discussion in the media, or you listen to people talking about foreign relations or whatever, and they're talking about, is this a free country or not? And if they say, it's democracies are this, that, and the other thing, okay? Democracy and freedom are not the same. That is, your ability to participate in elections isn't going to make it so that you are automatically free. But it is more likely, if you have a government that enjoys the support of the majority, right, which would happen in a democracy generally, a government that enjoys the support of the majority, it's more likely to produce liberty. Because why? Because in general, if you've read Hayek's Constitution of Liberty, or you've read Mises' Liberalism, or Bastiat's The Law, you go, oh yeah, we're better off in general as a society, we're better off if we have liberty. And if we know that, right, then we're going to, what's going to happen is we're going to vote for people who want to minimize the total amount of coercion that's going on in terms of your government. Again, it's not a one-to-one relationship. Just like Mises was saying, a free society is not a democratic society. Now, a democratic society will tend to be more free than authoritarian societies, but but they don't equate with one another. Now, one of the important aspects of democracy to Hayek is that in order to have a democratic vote, what happens? We're going to discuss issues, right? So, if I were king of the world, right? Or if I were, let's say I were the benevolent dictator of the United States, you wouldn't need to discuss how we ought to do things, right? Because I make the decision. But in a democracy, right, what happens in a democracy is a discussion among each other in order to make a decision about who you're going to vote for. Anybody watch the debate last night, presidential debate? Okay, you were watching the presidential debate and what's going on. Actually, there was more discussion of the issues in this one than there was in the first one. Okay, but so what for Hayek, when Hayek's watching, if Hayek were alive today and he watched this debate, he would say, okay, we got at least more discussion of the issues than we did in the first debate. And that's a good thing, because Hayek says the discussion of the issues, why do you want democracy? Or one reason that you want to have democracy, other forms of government, is the discussion of the issues will advance the state of knowledge. Right? So you can obviously see, if I ask you a question on the second midterm, and if you've looked through the old second midterms, you'll sort of see this. One of the things that I'm going to want you to tell me that, right? I want you to point out what Hayek is saying is that, remember, it's the use of knowledge that Hayek is interested in, right? How do we make the most efficient use of the fact that information is decentralized? And what he's saying is we're going to advance the state of knowledge by us discussing the issues, okay? Now, Hayek was not around to watch how MSNBC and CNN and Fox News and how within that particular station, they don't usually discuss both sides of the issues particularly well. But you could watch Fox News for a while, then turn around and watch the MSNBC for a while, right? And so the fact that they're discussing the issues can advance the state of knowledge for you folks, right? So in fact, I think I've mentioned that I like to watch Squawk Box in the morning because they have people come in from both sides of issues and actually make a discussion about that. So you can actually just watch one channel and get both sides talking to one another, okay, or talking in exchange with one another. But Hayek's main point here is that discussion of the issues is going to expand the range of knowledge, and that at least some of you will know more about the issues and you will be able to influence other people, or that notice that one of the things that you might think about is that at least some people we'll discuss this. Or, well, not this. We'll discuss the issues. Now, what do we know, right? That is that if you look at the opportunity cost of your time, how many have read Biden's complete discussion of what his program is going to be? Really? So we've got 2. It's more than I had thought. What are you going to do? You're going to look at the opportunity cost of your time, right? So if you look at the opportunity cost of your time, you can say, okay, I'm going to measure that against what is the benefit for me knowing about that, all right? So the benefit of you knowing about that might be relatively low, right? Because knowing that additional amount of information may not change what your preferences are. Or, again, if you take Econ 415, one of the things that we talk about is what's called the rational voter hypothesis. That is, you need to look at what's the expected value of your voting. And so one of the things you need to look at is what's the probability of your vote affecting the outcome. And if you look at it, if there are, let's say, 6 million people vote in the state of Michigan, how could your one vote affect the outcome? Your personal vote can affect the outcome by if there was a tie in Michigan and Michigan's electoral college votes made a difference in who became the president, right? So the probability of your vote affecting the outcome is very low, and so you got to measure the opportunity cost of your time against that. Now, that leads, again, we spend a whole lot of time about this in public choice. Why do people vote? There's lots of things you can think about. You might feel better that you voted, right? You might feel, because if we're thinking about a beach, right? If you took away all the pebbles of sand, there's no beach, okay? But if you took away one pebble of sand, there's still the beach, okay? So that it isn't as if your vote doesn't affect the outcome, but does your vote determine the outcome? And again, we spend a good deal of time on this, what's called this rational voter hypothesis, and we note that. But what's going to happen is that some people are going to know about it, right? So that even if you guys don't know much about the issues, some people are, because we're going to have a democracy. What's going to happen? The lobbyists are going to know about the issues, right? You may not know anything about the insurance code, but I can guarantee you there are lobbyists in let's say it's Michigan's House of Representatives and Senate. The Michigan government's going to make a decision about a law dealing with insurance companies. What will happen is there'll be lobbyists on either side of the issue, right? And they'll debate amongst each other, or at least they'll make their presentation to the members of the House and the Senate committee and et cetera, and they'll have hearings and all that stuff. Okay? So there's going to be a discussion of the issues, even if you guys don't know anything about it, right? Even if you guys are what's called rationally ignorant, not everybody's rationally ignorant. And so even if someone were to argue against Hayek saying, well, wait a minute, most people don't know all the details of the issues, still, there's going to be discussion about some of the issues. There may be some issues that you really care about, right? And you really care about it, so you're going to learn about that. Maybe you're worried about right to life, okay? So what will you do? You'll go out and you'll try to explain to other people about right to life issues, okay? Notice one way that you can have a cheap way of finding out about the issues is that, what can you do? You could give $5 to Right to Life, and what will they do? They'll give you a list of the candidates and what their position is on right to life, okay? So what happens is special interest groups and the like are a mechanism of reducing those costs for you of finding out information. But the main point here that Hayek's trying to make is that the discussion of the issues, and it's important to him, discussion of the issues, whether you do it individually or whether lobbyists do it or whether associations do it, that's going to advance the state of knowledge. All right, so for Monday, we'll definitely get through Chapter 7. Chapter 8 is, well, we're not going to talk about Chapter 8. It's something that you can just read and get out of it. And then we'll start Chapter 9. So if you want to get a little bit ahead, go ahead and start reading through Chapter 9, because it's one of the more important chapters in the book.